Okay. Hi, everybody. We're going to hang out here at our opening screen for just a minute while everyone rolls in and gets situated. If you guys would like to use the chat button at the bottom of the screen to type in the facility that you're watching from or where you are, who you're representing, we're happy to hear from you. We're happy to know who's watching tonight. And while we're waiting, we're just going to send some thoughts and prayers to our friends in Central Florida who are currently more than under hurricane watch. They're being hit by Hurricane Ian right now. So just thoughts and prayers out to them while we're waiting. Okay, we've still got some people rolling in, so we're going to hang out just another second and then we'll begin. All right, thank you and welcome. I want to remind everybody that this program is being recorded, and that is so we can post this on our website on ZAA.org so you can watch after the fact as well. So if you like this program and you want to share it with your friends, it will be on the members only section of ZAA.org. My name is Kate and I'm on the Professional Development Committee for ZAA. And for those of you joining us for the first time, this is ZAA's Professional Development Webinar Series. And the ZAA is the Zoological Association of America. It is a nonprofit, member-based accrediting organization dedicated to responsible wildlife management, conservation, and education. ZAA upholds the highest levels of professional standards in animal welfare, safety, and ethics. We've got some great webinars coming up in October. And a reminder to everybody, our webinars are every Wednesday at 6 p.m. Eastern Time, so set your calendars. In October, we're talking about conservation. So October 5th will be how to create your own conservation program. October 12th, we'll be talking about citizen science projects and specifically a box turtle tracking program that you can start at your own facility. And October 26th, we'll be talking about how to design an effective pledge card to help you raise money for those conservation programs. A couple of reminders, you guys are going to remain muted through the entirety of this presentation. There will be a Q&A at the end. So look at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A button. You're going to type your questions in there. And if you see a question that you like, go ahead and give it a thumbs up and that will boost that question and it'll be more likely to be asked. And again, all previously recorded webinars, so this one and all of the rest are available on the members only page at ZAA.org. Our national conference is coming up and it will be in Phoenix this year. So if you guys are looking for a really good time with a lot of great zoo education, November 29th through December 2nd, and you can register at ZAA.org for that. Tonight's presentation is from Shannon Livingston, who is currently riding out a hurricane. So we really thank her for showing up for this tonight. And we're talking about browse and toxic plants, browse and toxic plant ID and use. Shannon is an animal nutritionist at Disney's Animal Kingdom. She's been working with animal nutrition for 26 years. Her career began at the Toronto Zoo as a zookeeper and a mentor. She switched into nutrition at Toronto Zoo, and then her mentor there led her to her current role at Disney. She has a bachelor's and a master's degrees from the University of Guelph in Canada. Shannon, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right, let me share my screen. Oops, nope. All right, so can you hear me okay?
We can,
Yes.
yep.
All right, so let's get started. I'm going to talk about browse and toxic plants. I will give you a heads up ahead of time that I am not going to have all the answers for you. We're going to, well, let's just, whoop, why is it not going now? There we go. So we're going to talk a little bit kind of about the basics of browse. We're going to talk about where you can get browse and what you do with it once you've got it. How much you might want to put in your diets, some considerations that you're going to want to think about when you're looking at browse, some of the concerns that might come about of that, and some resources. So we'll kind of go through that. Hopefully I give you a lot of things to think about, and let's see where we end up. So browse basics, browse basically is the tender twigs, shoots, and leaves of trees and shrubs that are used by animals as food. It is a source of nutrients. So like Mike Maslenko was talking about last week, you need to consider everything that goes into an animal's diet. Browse is not just something you throw on top and it's, yeah, I got browse. It is a source of nutrients, and you need to consider that when you're looking at the total diet. It can help promote natural behaviors, especially for those animals that's a big part of their natural diet. It can be used for enrichment, and it could be something they eat. It could be something they play with. They can hide underneath it. They may make nests out of it. So it can be used for a lot of that as well. It can help protect exhibit plants. So if you're putting browse up around the area, hopefully it's drawing your animals away from eating their exhibit. And it can also enhance animal visibility. So by moving browse around the exhibit, you're also getting the animals to move around, and then your guests can get a better look at them. And then a browser obviously is an animal whose natural diet consists primarily of browse. So it could be things like giraffe, black rhinos, colobus monkeys, kangaroos, porcupines. There's a lot of different browsers out there. There's a lot of other animals that enjoy browse, but you know, your stick browsers are the ones whose their primary diet is based on leaves and twigs and shoots. So in terms of what do you use for browse, that is really going to depend a lot. So it's going to depend on you and where you are. It's going to depend on what grows in your area. So what do you have access to? That is the biggest thing. Ideally, if you're going to grow browse, you want something that's native. Well, you don't need something that's native, but it's helpful because you know it's going to grow in your area. Ideally, you don't want a non-invasive. So you try not to plant invasive plants. Florida is full of invasive things, so you don't want to add that to the environment. Ideally, you want a plant that's going to grow quickly. You don't want to put a lot of effort into planting things that you can feed to your animals, but then have it take 5 years to get to a point where you can actually harvest it and feed it to your animals. And you want something that's going to resist hard pruning, because you are going to have to cut that plant back in order to get branches with leaves that you can feed to your animals. Now, that's not to say you want something that you can cut back to the ground so it looks like it's gone through a nuclear winter. You want to leave some greenery on it so that it can, you know, get that energy back from the sun and regrow again quickly. But it needs to be able to grow back quickly and not go into like a state of shock and decide that it doesn't want to grow for 6 months. Also, when you're looking at what kind of browse you have or you want to look at what animals you have. So, and what are they going to eat? So are they super picky? If you have something like red pandas, you're probably going to want to grow bamboo. If you have koalas, you're going to want a source of eucalyptus. If you have some primates, you may want a different browse than if you have black rhinos or elephants or something like that. So you want to look at a whole lot of different variables when you're trying to figure out what's going to work for you for a browse plant. So these are some options that a lot of zoos use. I've gone through some different browse lists, and willow is a popular option. Mulberry, I know mulberry is one of the favorite for our animals. Aspen and poplar type species are very popular. Apple, banana. Again, this is really going to depend on where you live. I would love to be able to grow apple for our animals, but it just isn't going to grow in our climate. Alternatively, somebody, you know, up in northern New York State is probably not going to have a lot of success trying to grow banana or hibiscus and keep it going over the winter. So you have to look at different things like that. You may also want to look at, again, this is going to depend on where you are, but having different plants for different times of the year. So we may use something like willow and mulberry and hibiscus in the spring and summer, but those plants go dormant and they lose their leaves in the, I call it winter of Florida, but you know, they still go into a dormancy period where they don't have leaves. And then we'll switch to plants that are more evergreen. So they keep their leaves over the winter and we can feed them. In our case, we use Elaeagnus, which is silverberry, and we use the Japanese blueberry. Those are some of our bigger winter ones because they're both evergreen. and they work well for our animals. So when you're looking at where you can get browse, there's different options. You can grow it yourself. You can buy it, which can get expensive. You can harvest it from the zoo grounds or from nearby areas. You can work with partners, or there's even some zoos that take browse donations, and we're gonna go through some of those options. So if you're gonna grow it, your browse program or fields can be as big or as small as you have room for. So at Animal Kingdom, we're really fortunate. We have 100 acres where we can grow browse. We don't use all of that for plantings right now, but we have a lot of space where we can do that. Busch Gardens alternatively had a really nice, or has a really nice browse program on only 1/3 of an acre. So you can design your growth or browse program based on how much space you have. That said, there are certain things that you need to consider when you're coming through this. There's infrastructure involved. So obviously you need the space, but you need somebody, you need staff, you need people who can look after that. So they're gonna have to, they may have to water it. They're gonna have to plant it, obviously. They'll have to harvest it. They may need to manage the weeds or cut the grass around it. So they're gonna need some equipment, even if it's just a weed eater and some snippers. You may need fencing. So if your browsing species are going to like it, if you have local browsers like some white-tailed deer or moose or somebody else, they're also going to like your browse, and you may need to put fencing up to keep them out. I've had it told to me before that one of the best ways to figure out what to grow in your area is to ask the nurseries, what browse do the deer like? And if the deer go into the nurseries and eat there, you know, it's probably a good indication that might be a popular browse. You may need some irrigation. Again, this is going to depend on where you are and what your site looks like. You may need to amend the soil, add fertilizers, but there are different things that you need to consider when you're trying to figure out how you can build a browse program. And again, you have to find those plants that are going to work for you. So you're going to have to look at, you know, what will grow in your area and grow quickly. What you can get is a big one. So there may be plants that you're like, yeah, I want to grow this. But if it's not a big landscape plant, sometimes they can be really hard to find. So then you have to figure out how to propagate them so that you can get enough of them to plant them. So sometimes that can be a little tricky. You need to look at what's going to be safe for your animals. And we're going to get into that part a little bit later in the presentation, but browse safety is a big one. And then you also want to look at what your animals will eat. So I highly recommend that before you go crazy and start planting a whole bunch of plants, that you get small amounts of it to try and see if the animals will even eat it. Because you don't want to put a huge investment into planting something that your animals are going to turn their nose up at. So those are just some of the things that you want to consider if you're going to grow your own browse. You can buy it, and it can be expensive. It usually will need to be shipped, and that could be by UPS, FedEx, airplane, whatever, depending on what you're getting and where you're getting it from. Usually it's going to be in smaller quantities because it's got to be put into some kind of shipping boxes. If you have one that's within your state, you may be able to get it by the truck, in which case you could get bigger quantities. And I know a couple of suppliers in Florida that sell. I know there's at least one in Texas, and I couldn't find his name. So I was thinking maybe this could be one of those things where people could put in the chat if they have a browse supplier that they would recommend, or that they've used or that they know of, to help people find one. I tried Googling, you know, browse for zoos, and I did not have a whole lot of luck. So they usually do go to conferences, so it's a good option to go look at the vendor center and see if you can find some browse vendors at a conference. You can also look at harvesting it from the zoo, but to do this, you need to have somebody who's in charge of that. So whether it's somebody from horticulture or your vet team or nutrition or a curator, they need to approve certain plants that can be harvested around the zoo. One of the best ways to do this is to plant non-toxic edible species as you're plantings around the zoo. I highly recommend this just because you always know that a guest is going to try and pick a branch and throw it into an animal enclosure. And if they do that, you want to make sure that whatever they're grabbing is not going to hurt the animals. And then it also gives you a little bit more options of where you can go and harvest from. It can be used to hide fencing, all different things like that. But you do need to have a plan for harvesting. It can't be a free-for-all because then it's not going to last very long. So you would, in addition to having somebody who's going to approve it, you would want to have designated people to harvest it so that they're making sure that the harvest is being rotated. So you're not, taking it from one plant all the time. You want to make sure that they're properly identifying the plant so they're getting the right plant that's being able to be fed. And then that way you can make sure that it's getting rotated to different animals around the zoo. And it's not, say, for example, a giraffe keeper goes out and harvests it all the time. So the giraffe are the only one who get the browse if you have other browsers. So that can be an option. You can do some partnerships and donations. This can get a little trickier, and it does involve some element of trust. But you can partner with park departments or utility companies that are going to be harvesting, if they've got to cut down trees for utility work or from parks or something. And I've found that there's a few zoos I found on their websites that they'll ask for browse donations from the public. Obviously, this is something that's got to go through the directors of your zoo to see if this is something they're going to be willing to do. But you also need to set specific parameters or guidelines around what you will accept and in what condition you will accept them. The browse will also need to be received by somebody in particular that can identify that, yes, it is a safe browse. You've got to make sure that it wasn't treated with any pesticides or herbicides or have any kind of contamination with extra plants. You may want to look for hitchhikers, and by hitchhikers, I mean bugs that you may not want to get into your plant collection on the zoo. Sometimes you can get caterpillars in there, which can sting keepers and animals. And then once you've received it, you're probably going to want to clean it. You've got to figure out how to store it and then how to distribute it around the zoo to the different animals. And I know a few different zoos that do this. It is a lot of work, but with a good partnership, it can give you a lot of browse as well. This is some stuff that I pulled off a website from one of the zoos that does accept browse donations. And I like it because if you look over here, they specifically tell you what browse species they can take. And it gives both the common name and the scientific name. So there's less chance for a mix up of getting the wrong plant. And then they had another site or another page on their website that had a frequently asked questions page where people could, obviously they're going to have questions about, will you take the whole tree? Are you going to come to my house and do it? I'm here at your gate, come and get it. And it has drop-down menus that will give them those answers of, this is what we can do, this is what we can't do, this is how you arrange it. So I like this as an option because it gives you those different options and sets those parameters to try and make sure that it's safe. Storing browse can be tricky. So if you have it, what are you going to do with it? If you're lucky, you can have a cooler, so you can harvest the browse, and as soon as you harvest it, you bundle it up and you can put it into a cooler where then it can be distributed to the animal areas while it's still fresh. This middle picture here is actually the freezer of a zoo that has one of those partnerships. So they'll get in big loads of browse in a truck, and they have the team will go through and receive it, and they put it into these tote bins. They'll label what browse species is in there and what animals it can go into, and then it goes in the freezer, and then they can use that all winter long. So again, you've got to have the space for that. It can be fairly labor intensive, but it's a good option. I know other people who've tried cryo vacuum freeze, like vacuum sealing it into plastic bags. That can be tricky too because browse is pokey and it likes to go through plastic, but that's another option. And then there's other options too. So the Toronto Zoo is the other one there. They actually make silage. So they have a silage press, and they'll go out in large teams and put browse into these little buckets, sealing the air out of it, and then they can use those in the winter months. That can be very labor intensive, and you need to make sure that you're doing it properly. So if you do want to try the silage route, you're going to want to get somebody who's really familiar with silage to help you out with that, because if you don't get the right fermentation profile, the browse can actually be dangerous for your animals. And we tried doing it in here at Disney, and it was a lot of work. We don't do it anymore. So this is a question we get a lot, is, how much browse can I feed? And again, that is really going to depend. It's going to depend on your collection. How many browsers do you have to feed, and how much browse do you have to feed them with? If you have target browsers, you may want to give them kind of higher priority over other animals. So for me, I would consider target browsers are going to be things like giraffe, black rhinos, elephants, gorillas, colobus monkeys, could be porcupines, and it's going to depend on each individual institution. You want to look at what else you're feeding, because again, it's got to fit into that whole balanced diet. It's not just an addition on top that doesn't mean anything. It is providing nutrients into the diet. So you need to make sure that it's balancing with everything else. And you also want to look at what else they have access to. And again, this goes back to what Mike was talking about last week, is anything that the animals are eating, you should try and account for that when you're looking at the total nutrient intake of those animals. In terms of you're trying to figure out what is the nutrient composition of browse, so you want to see like, okay, I'm feeding this browse, but what does it mean? What nutrients is it giving to the animals? There's different ways you can do that. So if you go on Google Scholar and you type in browse nutrient composition, these are some of the papers that will come up. You can also look at the Nutrition Advisory Group website, and I have that on later that you can see what it is. The European Nutrition Group, EASA Nutrition Group, they may also have some browse information on there. There has been talk of trying to put together a browse nutrient database. I'm not sure how close we are to making that happen, but it's in the works. But there is information out there that can kind of give you at least the basic idea of what's in my browse, so that I can try and make sure that it does fit into a diet, or, a complete diet. All right. So some of the considerations that you want to look at when you've got in the browse is, how are you going to offer it? Ideally, you want to tie it up or tie it down. You want the animals to work for it, especially because you want to encourage those natural behaviors. So our photo of the giraffe down there, the browse is put in a browse feeder up in the tree. So it's eating like it naturally would at its height. It can pick each individual leaf off if that's what they want to do. And if you think about it, most browsers, when they're eating browse in their natural environment, they're going to pick off a certain portion of the diet. So they may pick a leaf off, they may pick a small twig off or a shoot. But if the browse is tied up, they can do that as well. If you just put the browse in a pile somewhere, if they go to grab a leaf, 2 or 3 branches could come out. They may get a couple of leaves off of that, but then the branch could fall to the ground. They may not pick it up off the ground. Another animal could scoop in there underneath them and grab it, who is maybe not one of your target species. So if you're putting a lot of effort into getting browse into your diets, you want to make sure you're making the most of it, and you don't want it to be wasted by getting dropped on the ground. That said, there may be times where you don't want it to be tied down. Maybe you have some animal interaction, so you have a group of animals, and you have one animal who will like to hoard it all. So in that case, you may want to spread it out in individual branches where they can kind of grab a piece and run off with it, where they can eat it in peace. That tends to work a little better for the primates, like our colobus friend there, because they're much more dexterous with their fingers, so they can sit there and actually pick off individual leaves. So that works a little bit better for them. But a lot of times you want to make sure it's tied up so that they can't just grab a piece and waste most of it. And now we get into some of the concerns with browse. So one of them can be contamination. And that could be from chemicals. So somebody could have been sprayed with some kind of pesticide or herbicide. They could even be like exhaust fumes, or if it's grown along the side of a road up north, it could have road salt or something on it. You could get insects in there, which could be anything from ants to wasps to caterpillars or anything else in between. And then you can also get unwanted plants in there. So this little picture of the hay there, it's just a hay that's full of a weed. So it's not your target plant. That's not why you bought a bale of hay, to get all that weed in there. So it's the same thing with browse. Vines in particular like to get up in there, and they're hard to get out. So you've got to make sure that you don't have any of those in there. And you want to look at kind of general safety. So you want to make sure that it's safe for the animal to eat. You want to make sure that there's some plant safety in there, that again, that plant is safe for your animal to eat. And keeper safety is also something you want to think of, especially if you're going to go fancy like this thorny acacia. If you want to be, you know, very true to their natural diet, and you've got a source of thorny acacia, the giraffe may like that. I'm going to guess the keeper's probably not so much, because that's going to be like dealing with a bougainvillea, and you're like going to feel like a pincushion. So, and again, with insects as well, they can be an issue for keepers. So there's different safety things you want to consider there. So just like people, we want to protect ourselves. So whenever we're doing anything, you may have different PPE. It could be eye protection, gloves, hard hat, whatever. Nature has different ways of saying, don't touch me, I'm dangerous. And plants are no different. So plants are going to protect themselves. They may use thorns. They may have insects that live within them that help protect them from animals that want to eat their leaves. They can have secondary compounds in their leaves that could make it taste bad. It could also make animals sick. They may have little hairs or spines or things on the plants that are going to cause irritation. So there's different ways that plants provide their own PPE to protect themselves. So all plants are not safe, and they can defend themselves. They're actually really cool. So there's plants that if a certain insect comes to try and eat the leaf, they send out signals to like another insect that's going to come and attack that insect. So if they had caterpillars coming to eat their leaves, they can, and this depends on the plant, doesn't happen all the time, but you know, they can signal to like a parasitic wasp or something that's going to come and get that caterpillar. So there's some really cool adaptations that plants have come up with to protect themselves. And that would be that insect army. They can have those physical deterrents. So again, spines, those nasty, irritating hairs, think of like stinging nettle and stuff like that. Secondary compounds, we're going to talk about that very shortly, but chemicals that they have within their leaf system that are going to try and deter herbivores from eating them. And some plants are just crazy, all out dangerous. And nobody in their right mind would ever consider using these as browse. I just found out about these plants, and I think they're super cool and really kind of scary. And of course, they're in Florida. So one of them is called a manchineel tree, and every part of this tree is completely deadly. So they have little fruits on them that if you eat that, it'll kill you. If you stand under this tree in a rainstorm, the sap will drip on you and it'll cause burns. It can make you blind. If you try and burn it, the smoke can make you blind. It's crazy. So again, like super interesting way that this plant protects itself. And then the one next to it is a poisonwood tree, also found in Florida. But if you think of poison ivy and the chemical that's in poison ivy that causes reaction with people, the poisonwood tree is 100 times more potent than the poison ivy thing. So you won't ever consider them. I just think they're really cool that they protect themselves like that. So when we get into secondary compounds, these are the things that are going to protect the leaves. It is not in any plant's best interest to have animals come and eat all their leaves, because the leaves are how they get all their nutrients and energy through photosynthesis and everything like that. It is estimated that there are over 200,000 different compounds that plants have developed to protect themselves, and they can be terpenoids, they're phenolics, they're alkaloids, they're glycosides, they're all kinds of different compounds, and they can always be present in the leaf. They may not be present in the leaf at all, or they can increase with herbivory. And that's one of those things why you want to make sure that if you're harvesting plants, that you're not over harvesting it, because then the plant may think that it's being predated on by an herbivore, and it's going to protect itself by creating more of those secondary compounds. So you can usually get away with, you know, a couple, maybe 1 or 2 harvests per year. But if you're going back week after week and cutting branches from the same plant, it's probably going to increase the amount of secondary compounds that it's putting out in their leaves to protect itself. And the effects of these secondary compounds can be mild to deadly. They may not impact some animals at all. They could be very mild. It may just be like a mild rash. It could give stomach upset. Some of them can cause seizures and death. And some of it is going to depend entirely on the animal that's eating it. Some animals can eat something that would kill another animal. And we'll try and get into that a little bit more in a second. And just as, you know, it can also include toxins from the environment. So you want to make sure that you're planting it in safe. You don't want to plant your browse garden on a chemical dump or something like that, because it's going to pick that up from the soil. Not that anyone would do that, but I'm just throwing it out there. Some definite no's. So these are things that you never want to give to an animal, and ideally won't have anywhere near an animal. Oleander, every part of the oleander plant is deadly, and it does not take a lot to kill something. Yew is another one that is very deadly. Rhododendrons and azaleas, another beautiful plant, but deadly. And then red maple, which is mostly an issue for equids. So horses get poisoned a lot from eating wilted red maple leaves, especially when they've dropped in the fall. But it can also be an issue with zebras and other things. So again, it's just one of those ones that's, it's, you know, keep it out of the area so that you don't have to worry about it. These are some headlines or papers that I found with a quick, you know, zoo animal poisoning search. So it does happen. Thankfully, it doesn't happen a lot, but we want to make sure that it doesn't happen at all. And so that's why you need to do a lot of research when you're trying to figure out what to feed your animals. And just remember again that because a plant is safe for one animal, it is not safe for all animals. Certain animals are better at dealing with secondary compounds than others. Ruminants tend to be, because the microbial fermentation of their digestive system helps detoxify a lot of those secondary compounds. That's not to say that you can give anything to a ruminant, because there are certain things they can't detoxify, but in general, they tend to be able to deal with some of the secondary compounds better than animals with a more simple digestive system or hindgut fermenters. There's always going to be a special case, because that's just how animals are. So koalas, for example, they're eating eucalyptus. That would probably kill pretty much any other animal that tried to eat it. And then this cute little wood rat here, this is a desert wood rat, and these guys eat creosote trees. And they've developed, you know, ways of detoxifying the toxins in creosote through microbial action, so that they can eat something that would easily kill another animal much, much larger than them. And dose is also important. So sometimes it takes a lot of something. Even water can be toxic if you drink too much water. Spinach can be toxic if you drink, or if you eat too much spinach. So if you give an animal a small amount of browse and they do okay with it, that doesn't mean you can give them a huge amount of it until you're more familiar with it and you've established that it's truly a safe thing to feed. So one of the ways to check is to do a thorough search of the plant in question. And I'll give you a list of some websites that I use that I find helpful. but don't take the word of one website. I like to at least try and get 3 that tell me it's either toxic or non-toxic, but be prepared to find nothing. Because in a lot of cases, what we want to feed to animals is not something that people generally feed. So there isn't information because nothing's happened with it before. Nobody's tried to feed it to an animal, so there was nothing to report. So that can be a little frustrating, and be prepared for it to happen, but you still want to look. Google Scholar can be a good way a good resource to look for things. But a lot of times it'll pull up papers where people have looked at purified compounds within the leaf that they're looking at from a medicinal standpoint. But it can still be helpful because a lot of times they'll test it on rats or mice, and they'll look for the lethal dose. And so you can see if, this was toxic in very small quantities to an animal or not. It can at least give you an indication of probably not a good thing to use. I do tend to be a little bit wary of plants where they come up and how it tells you that it's a medicinal plant and it cures everything. Typically plants that have a lot of medicinal properties have a lot of secondary compounds, so it's just something to be wary of. When you are looking for plants or looking for information on plants, use the scientific name, because common names can vary from area to area within the country. And so I may have a plant in my garden that I call a firebush, and there's a completely different plant in Utah that's also called a firebush. So you want to use the scientific name to make sure you're looking up information on the actual plant that you're looking at, and not just something that has the same common name. Again, you want to verify plant identity, and when in doubt, leave it out. And I have these 2 pictures on here just kind of as an example. So this is willow and elderberry. They often grow side by side in the roadside around here in Central Florida. And if there was an instance where somebody said, oh, if you need willow, you can go harvest it from this ditch over here. It's the plant with the long pointy green leaves. If you're not sure which one of those it is, they both kind of have long pointy green leaves. The willow is safe to feed, the elderberry is not. So you want to make sure that you know exactly what the plant looks like when you're going to get it, and it's not just something with long pointy green leaves, because that could be a lot of different things. So some of the resources that you can look up, there's some books out there. You've got the Toxic Plants of North America. If we have people joining us from elsewhere, I'm sure there are toxic plants of Australia or various parts of Europe as well. Poisonous plants of Eastern North America. I would hope there's one for Western North America or Northern North America as well, but you want to look for that. There are a lot of toxic plant websites, and I'm going to show those in a second. Some of them may be of more use than others. There is the Association of Zoological Horticulture, and they've done in the past, they've done classes on browsing toxic plants. I actually went to their class, it was probably about 10 years ago now, but it was a great class, and it went through a lot of the same information in much, much more detail. I checked their website and I didn't see a listing of the class coming up again soon, but it's something you can keep an eye out for and see if they're going to offer it again. The Nutrition Advisory Group website, that's that nagonline.net. That's a great resource. The ZAA Nutrition Group, if you Google that, their website will come up. And your local university extension can be a great resource as well. Why am I not moving? There we go. So these are some of the different websites that I like to use, and I can get this list to Kate so she can get it out for people to use as a resource as well. I will say I can't guarantee that all these websites are still going to be there when you go. For whatever reason, I have found that toxic plant websites tend to disappear. So I've had ones in the past that were really good, and I went back to use them after about a month and it was completely disappeared. I just got the 404 error, and I haven't been able to find it again since. But some of these are really good. Again, some are more useful than others, but I try and look as many of these as I can to get consensus as to whether or not a plant is safe either to use as browse or even to plant in an exhibit, to make sure that it would be safe to be in an area with an animal. So this is an example of the University of California one. I do like this one. It's mostly garden plants, so it's not always as helpful for some of the browse species, but I find it helpful when I'm trying to determine if a plant is safe to go into an animal exhibit. But you can look up safe plants and toxic plants by both the common name and the scientific name, which I like. It gives you kind of some basic information on, safe and poisonous plants. Like, did you know how many people are, have to call poison control each year because they've eaten something out of their garden? And then when you look at the toxic plants, they go through and they determine, or they discuss different toxicity classes. So from major to minor, oxalates, dermatitis. And then when they list the domestic or the toxic plant, they tell you which class that falls into. And I really like that. I find it really helpful. So this is one I like. Other sources of potentially dangerous plants can be from your hay. And this is where it's helpful to know where is your hay grown. So you want to know what weeds are prevalent in that area, what is likely to be contaminating that hay, and to keep an eye out for it. You want to look at what weeds could be present in your enclosure that can impact animals. And again, the University Extension Services can be a great resource for this one. So some of these plants I've thrown on here, the one in the bottom left-hand corner with the little pink flower, it's a tiny little ground cover. It grows in Florida. It's called creeping indigo, and it is a big problem with horses. It kills equids if they eat them. And I know a couple of people who've lost tortoises that have grazed on this plant as well. So it's one you want to look out for. The middle bottom one there is nightshade, and nightshade in various forms grows all over the place, and it is problematic for many species. Beside that is snake root, which grows in a large portion of North America and is also very toxic. And then the one kind of the top right there is rosary pea. That tends to be more of a southeast plant, but again, it's one of those really, it's a vine. So if it gets into your browse, throw that browse out, burn it, get it out. One of those tiny little red pea things, I mean, it's literally the size of a pea, can kill an adult human. So they're very, very toxic, and you do not want that anywhere near any of your animals. So there's different ways that plants are going to sneak in, and you've just got to keep an eye out for them. So these are just a couple of the extension websites that I pulled up. The University of Florida's got a great one, Texas A&M, Michigan State. If you have a good agricultural university near you, check and see if they've got a good resource that has, it could have pasture weeds, it could have toxic plants. They got a lot of great information there. So kind of looking at a wrap up and a takeaway, again, I know I'm sorry I didn't give everybody the answer they want, like I can feed this to my animal, but hopefully it got you thinking. So browse can and should be an important part of a browser's diet. It is an important source of nutrients. It can encourage natural behaviors. Maybe it can help protect your exhibit plants. Maybe the animals will find the exhibit plants more exciting because you don't want them to eat it, but browse can help with that. And browse does take work. It's not just something simpler, oh, I'm going to cut this from this branch over here. There's a lot of work involved, but it's worth it. Biggest one is do not assume a plant is safe to feed. Plants want to protect themselves, so you need to make sure that you're going to find an animal-friendly plant, and that's what you're going to feed to your animals. So research is involved, and again, when in doubt, leave it out. And with that, I am, I guess, going to take some questions.
Get unmuted here. Okay, thank you so much, Shannon. I really appreciate it. And again, we appreciate you joining us during a hurricane, which I don't want anybody to forget because it's so amazing. And we have had questions rolling in the whole time. So I am going to start asking right off the bat. And I want to apologize right now that those of you who put the scientific names of some of the plants in, I'm going to say them wrong. So the first question, which has gotten a lot of thumbs up, is has any Animal Kingdom or anybody that you know of done an analysis to determine protein nutrient levels in fresh versus frozen browse?
We have done in fresh versus in siled browse. I do believe there are some papers out there looking at fresh versus frozen, but I don't know what those values are offhand. But I will say, if you're going to look at that information, you also want to look at, when was that browse harvested? Because your nutrient content of browse is going to change seasonally. So if you harvest, I'm going to say willow, for example, or any plant, if you harvest it in the spring when it's fresh leaves, it's going to have a higher sugar content and a lower fiber content than at the end of the summer, when the plant has used up that sugar as energy, and there's going to be more fiber in the thing. So there, plant nutrients can change over a season, but I can't say offhand how they change when they're frozen. I would suspect it's mostly going to be vitamins that are impacted through freezing, but I haven't looked at it myself, so I can't say for sure.
Excellent. Is there a recommendation for a ratio for browse to starch for ruminants? So browse to pellets for ruminants?
There isn't. And again, that's going to depend on what pellet you're using. I am a strong proponent of a low starch pellet. So if you can get a high fiber, low starch pellet, you're ahead of the game already. So just for an example, for us, we would like to have about 30% of a diet for, say, our giraffe or our okapi as browse, but that's not always possible. And I think even if you can get 5% of your diet as browse, that's better than 0%. Nobody here is probably, unless you've got a giant paddock and you're feeding moose and you live up in Minnesota, you probably are not going to be able to give an animal an entirely natural diet of browse. In their natural environment, they could be eating from hundreds of different plants and different plant parts throughout the year. So if we've got access to one or two, it's not going to be a balanced diet, and it's not going to make up for that. But I think any percentage of browse that you can get into a browser's diet is great. Just don't expect to make it too much, because again, you can only do what you have. If you have a small amount of browse in their diet is better than no browse.
Excellent. Thank you.
But again, I didn't really answer that, but it's looking at the overall nutrient content as opposed to a ratio of you need this much hay to this much pellet to this much browse. You want to look at what that all does together.
Excellent. Do you have a practical resource or a guide that you could share with everybody to use with keepers as a quick reference for safe browse species?
I don't have one. We have one, like we've put together a PowerPoint for the browse species that we use at Animal Kingdom. And I think this, again, is going to depend on where your zoo is and what you have access to. But once you've determined that a species is safe and you have access to it, then putting that into some kind of notebook or a resource that keepers can easily access is a great way to say, okay, this plant is safe to use, and give them the identification, parameters of this is how the leaves look, this is how they come off the stem, this is how tall it is. You want to make sure that it's going to be very hard for them to mistake that for something else.
Yeah, and we have something similar to what you're talking about. Our horticulturalist here at Zoo World has put together a wonderful PowerPoint, and she was very specific. It's got the bark of the trees, it's got the different shapes of the leaves, and actually seasonal differences as well. And we found that that's been very handy at our park. Is the keepers can access that, but they still ask our horticulturalist if it's the correct plant and should they cut it from where it is. But the pictures are key for that.
Yeah, and I will say I got this probably 20 years ago. It was from the Denver Zoo and the University of Colorado. It was like little recipe card size. They were laminated, and it had the picture of the plant on it. It was on a 3-ring, and I still have it. It's a great resource to look through, and it tells you, this is the plant. These are the type of animals that can eat it. But I hate to say that I don't know if it's even available anymore or where you would find it. But if you find one, hold on to it.
Yeah. Now we have a kind of a specific question. Can colobus monkeys eat tree of heaven? And I'm gonna try for the scientific name. Ailanthus, I think is what it is.
I am going to say that I am not familiar with that plant, so I would say do a lot of research on that before you try and feed it to a colobus. Yeah, I can't give you an answer on that one. I'm not familiar with that plant. It's not something that I have fed to a colobus.
Okay. And there's a question regarding some browse and toxic plant resources that this person has seen. They said they've seen some lists where safe browse and toxic browse are the same plant, but on both lists. How does that happen?
It happens a lot. And I think in some cases, if one of the lists may be overly cautious, and it may be toxic to certain species, but not to others. So it could be something that you wouldn't want to give to a dog or a cat, but it would be fine for a ruminant. So I will say it does happen a lot. And that's why I say to look at multiple resources to figure out if you're comfortable feeding that animal or feeding that browse a lot. Sometimes you can talk to other people and find out, it may be listed on, say, the ASPCA website as this is a toxic plant, but I know other people who feed it to animals and I trust them and I know they've been doing it for years. So maybe I'm going to err a little bit on the riskier side and try that browse. But I will say it does happen a lot where it can be listed as both safe and toxic, depending on the list. And it's also the level of toxicity. So, something like Brazilian pepper, that is an invasive plant in Florida, obviously, again, because everything invasive is in Florida. But it's listed as toxic but that toxicity is more of a dermatitis, so it can cause irritation. But I know a lot of people who feed Brazilian pepper to their animals with no problem. So sometimes it can be the level of toxicity that it's maybe just an irritant because it'll give you a rash, but animals don't seem to mind at all.
Okay, and another kind of specific one. Can giraffes eat Elaeagnus?
They can. They may not like it. We have Elaeagnus. That's that silver leaf or silverberry. It's one of our winter browse, and our giraffe don't particularly care for it. But I believe I watched the horticulture, the exhibit planting from Fort Worth Zoo a couple of weeks ago, and they planted it in their giraffe exhibit and as an exhibit plant, and their giraffe thought it was very tasty.
Always when you have it as an exhibit plant, right?
If you don't want them to eat it, it's just that much more desirable.
Yeah, exactly. Do you know of any sources for a browse-based pellet?
I have heard of one from South Africa called Boscos, but I do not know enough about the browse or the pellet itself to recommend it. I believe they're just basically chopping up some browse in South Africa and turning it into a pellet. I don't know people that recommend it. I know a couple of people that use it, but I don't know enough about it to recommend it. And I probably wouldn't go to the expense of importing something from South Africa if you're in North America.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. Now we do have some comments that I want to make sure everybody is seeing. It seems that our chat function might not be working tonight. So if you look in the Q&A, we've got some good resources that have been listed from some of our viewers. Browseposter.co.uk, and we have, let's see, I'll pull them up real quick. Zooplants.net was another one that was suggested. So, and I apologize that is not working in the chat function, but I'm leaving them up in the Q&A if you guys want to scroll through them and see them. And I also have a message that says AZH is working on getting their courses available again, and
Awesome.
they are coming back from the pandemic. So everybody should be checking that out because they'll have relevant coursework for this topic. Now we have just a couple of minutes left, so if anybody has any other questions and you want to type them into the Q&A, now is the time to do it. And I have somebody who says that they feed their animal Boscos and they sell it at their facility. But Marissa, I don't see where you're located. So if you want to type that in, I can let everybody know as well. And I am hearing that Tree of Heaven is not good for colobus. Okay, and
I'm just going to throw out quickly too, it's not necessarily a toxic thing, but there are other aspects of plants that you may want to consider as well. So some of the grasses or things like bamboo, they do have a lot of silica in them. So they can sometimes wear down the teeth of animals if you give them too much. Something like a panda who is, kind of evolved with that doesn't seem to bother it so much. But if you were to give nothing but bamboo to some other species, you may run into some dental issues. So just another thing to consider.
So you're saying that there are negative side effects for some browse that are not related to toxins?
Yes.
Are there?
I mean, you would have to eat a lot of bamboo, but if that was something that grew really easily and that was your main browse source, I would just keep an eye on the dental health of some of those animals that eat a lot of it.
Oh, that's excellent. I think bamboo is a very popular one for everybody. All right, give me cruise through here one more time and see if we have any other questions. Tortoise Table is a good app for safe tortoise browse. And Tanganyika Wildlife Park in Kansas is feeding the Boscos grain if anybody wanted to reach out and talk to them about it. All right, and with that, we are going to close tonight's discussion. And Shannon, again, thank you so much. You are a trooper to join us tonight, and we will see you guys next Wednesday. Have a nice night.
Bye, everybody.